we will now notice that our select collection selector does not work anymore. The reason being that we've modified our collections inside of our reducer to now be an object. Whereas our select collections and then the component using it in our collections overview still thinks that it's an array. Now, what can we do about this? Well, we can actually create a new selector that can convert our object into an array. And how we do that is we will make a new selector called select collections for preview. And what we'll do is we'll create the selector, and then we'll get our select collections because we do want the object. And what we'll do with the collections object is we're actually going to call a method called object.keys. What object.keys does is it gets us all of the keys of an object that we pass into it and gives it to us in an array format. So what does this look like? Well, let's actually see it first. So we have our error because our collections.map is not a function because it's trying to call .map on our collections object, right? Which you cannot do. So let's actually do this just to see first what object.keys do. If we make a new object, test object, where we get a property A goes to 1, B goes to 2, and C goes to 3. If we call object.keys on our test object, we'll get an array with the keys as the values inside of it. So however many properties there are is how many values we'll get. And what we'll do is we will get the keys off of our collections, right? So now we'll have all of the values that the object has, which are, if we look at our state, which is our hats, jackets, men's, sneakers, and women's, because we want these objects in an array instead. So what we'll do is we'll .map over this array of keys that we have, and what we'll return with the key is we will give our collections at that key value. So what we're saying is that we want to get all the keys and then map over that array of keys so we get the value of our collections object at that key, which will give us an array of our items that we're trying to get, which is pretty much the same way that we had it when we were trying to call our original select collections when it was an array. So we'll pull this into our collections overview component, replace select collections, like so. And now if we save, we'll see that our component still works the way that it does. Now, currently the way that our component works is that our collections preview component is the one that filters the item down to 4. We can theoretically also do this inside of our get preview collections, which is here where we got to consider a trade-off. So right now in our collections preview is the component that independently decides what it should do with the items once it's passed in, because we filter it down to 4 inside the collection preview component. Alternatively, inside of our collection overview component, we can make it so that our selector is the one that actually filters it down to 4 before it passes them in as the collections array. And this is kind of where it becomes a matter of principle. So yes, we are selecting the collections in our collections overview, and then our collections overview is the one that decides to pass them and render them in the preview. And personally, I prefer it this way because our collection preview only wants to ever display 4 items, right? So this is a case where the separation is that our collection preview is the one that's in charge of deciding what it should render. And theoretically, because we'll only ever render 4 items, we want to do this here. Now, let's say, for example, our collection preview suddenly was able to display more in a scrolling-like feature, where you can imagine if there were little arrows on the side, we would render perhaps all of the items, or up to 8. And if you click the arrow, it would cycle to the next set of items. Well, if that were the case, then we would definitely want all of the items inside of our collection preview. So it becomes more clear that our collections preview is the one that should be in charge of deciding on how it should render the list of items. Now, we could also write a selector on our collection preview so that instead of passing items directly into the collection preview, we would pass it similar to how we did our select collection, the actual key that it needed in order to get that array of items. But at the same time, in order for us to do that, we also need our collections overview then to get that map of keys to map over and pass them into still our collections preview. So it's like extra steps and some separations, right? I'm not going to tell you which one is better, but these are the trade-offs that you got to think about when composing out your components. We got to think about how much separation do we want? How much of the future do we want to plan for, right? And what's more likely? And this is all going to be based off a case-by-case basis when you're in a professional setting. Because when you evaluate this, you'll be given designs or kind of like a basic product outline of what they want the application to have. And here is where you can kind of ask these questions if you're unsure. Because in some way, this will kind of dictate how you set up your components and where we do what separation of what ideas. And I know it's all very high level right now, but I definitely think it's an important thing for us as developers to start thinking about as we code. Because when we think about these things and we encounter these kind of situations, this is where the learnings will really sink in as to why we write code the way we do. Because it allows us to see and make these decisions based on real world situations, right? Based on a real feature requirement. We can figure out how we should architect our code depending on whether or not there will be a different feature, whether or not that even the website for what we have right now, is this an MVP? Will this change in the future, and how will it change? We want to structure our application so that we can reduce the amount of code that we need if something changes, right? We don't want to scramble across our application making all of these changes in order to update something small. Instead, we want to keep the majority of our code in the right place concerning the right things so that mentally, if something changes, we know what to do. For example, I'm very comfortable keeping the items inside of our collection preview, right? The filter down to the 4, because our collection preview is going to be solely in charge of what number of elements to display and how to display them. And if that were to change in the future, I know that all I have to do is make the changes inside of my collection preview component. Now, I know this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but we're definitely going to start talking more and more about these kind of trade-offs and decision-making, as well as how we evaluate what we're going to build from this point of the lesson onwards. Because now that we have a solid fundamental understanding of React and Redux, as we practice this, we really got to start thinking more about these kind of things. And this is what will take us from being a beginner React developer to being a more intermediate one, into being a more senior one. So let's commit this code. Let's go to our terminal. Let's check what we have. And it looks like we added a lot of stuff. So we're going to say moved our directory and shop data into its own reducer, and then created respective selectors and updated corresponding components with new Redux flow for directory/shop. Oh, whoops. Did I forget to git add? Yes, I did. Push it up. And continue with our lessons.